Where the Rivers Meet, Chapter 2. Entering the school was like climbing through the mouth of an old mine shaft out by Marble Lake. Nancy had once entered it on a dare. In the building, sunlight was replaced by gloomy corridors lit by the glare of fluorescent lights, and the warmth of the day was replaced by metallic coldness. Somewhere down behind the mysterious locked doors, deep in the basement, like a giant air conditioner was methodically refrigerating the place. Nancy could almost feel frost forming on the windows. She thought she could feel the floors throbbing to the soundless hum of the thing. She stood inside the door uncertainly. On her left were the yellow doors to the gym, and on her right was the hallway with its bright orange doors into the stark cinder block and vinyl classrooms. In front of her, in the office, Donut Stevenson was sitting grimly behind the glass as she pounded on typewriter keys. She was the school secretary, and as long as anyone could remember, she'd worn her graying hair pulled back in the thick bun that gave her the nickname. Nancy could try and sneak by her and get into the classroom without being seen, but she had biology first, Quigley, and that was bad news. He would be sure to mark her late, and then she would be called down to the office to face charges of being late and neglecting to sign in. It was better to face Donut's wrath now than on a double rap later. Nancy walked through the door into the office and up to the counter. Donut refused to acknowledge her and continued attacking the typewriter as though it had offended her in some way. Nancy slapped her books down loudly. "I am aware of your presence, Miss Antone," Donut snapped in her clipped English accent. "There is no need to bang about." Nancy bit back a reply and stood mutely. Finally, Donut ripped the paper out of the typewriter and slammed it down on the table. She stood up and eyed Nancy with distaste. "Late again, Miss Antone? The 6th time this month. What's your excuse today?" Something flared in Nancy, and she heard herself say, "Oh, well, I had a breakfast meeting with the Prime Minister." Donut's eyes grew wide and narrowly dangerous. A red rash crept up her neck. "Don't get impertinent with me," she hissed. "I can have you out of here so fast it'll take your breath away." Nancy knew she wasn't kidding. It was Donut who ran the school, not Mr. Patterson, the principal. He cowered behind his closed doors most of the day, emerging only to hand a letter to Donut or pick up a memo. He viewed the world through his secretary's eyes. If she wanted Nancy out, all Donut needed to do was feed him some acid comments about Nancy's attendance and behavior, and she was a goner. Nancy lowered her eyes and mumbled an apology. Sorry, Miss Stevenson. It's been a hard week." Donut nodded slightly. "That's better. Now sign in. Any more unexcused absences this month will be reported to Mr. Patterson." Nancy quickly signed the sheet on the black binder, and picked up her books. As she walked down the hall, she fought back the angry tears that welled up in her eyes. Finding herself in front of her classroom, she hesitated before opening the door, and steeled herself for Quigley's remarks. Quigley was probably the most hated person at Craigton Secondary. It wasn't just that he ran the dullest classroom in the school, or even that he was nasty or to the point of being cruel. There was something even more insidious about the man. Whatever she could say about the other teachers in school, Nancy at least felt that in their own way they had wanted their students to learn, to succeed. They might not have the vaguest idea how to relate to students, and their lectures might have all the zip and freshness of flat beer, but at least they hoped their students would do well. But Quigley was different. He seemed to delight in failing students, especially Indian students. He bullied and intimidated, harried Indian pupils into withdrawal, as if he needed to constantly prove in his own dark bigotries through their failure. Like last week when he had confronted Amanda Johnny in class. He had collected papers that were due that day, and Amanda's wasn't there. He stalked down the aisle and stood over her like some livid demon. "Where's your paper, young lady? Have you ever gotten a paper in on time?" Amanda sat quietly and stared at her desk, which seemed to enrage Quigley even more. "Answer me when I ask a question," he screamed, pounding on the desk with his fist, "and look at me when I'm speaking to you." Amanda sat rigid as stone, and Quigley flew into an absolute rage. His usually ruddy face flushed a bright crimson. The veins on his broad forehead stood out like thick strings. "I will not tolerate disrespect and insolence in my classroom," he raged, thrusting his face inches from her. "If you do not look at me and answer me this instant, I will have you suspended from school." Nancy felt her stomach tighten until it hurt. She looked around the room, but everyone's eyes were averted. Amanda suffered, totally alone, humiliated and powerless. But just as horrible was the inaction of the class and of Nancy. She desperately wanted to stop the ordeal, but she too sat watching in agony, silent. Finally, even Quigley had enough, and Amanda had never shown the slightest response. He stood up and pointed to the door. "Get out," he snarled. "Now!" Amanda had quickly packed up her books and slunk quietly through the door. Quigley had gotten her suspended for 2 days, but Amanda would never be back. One thought kept pounding in Nancy's head. We were all too scared to lift a finger to stop the pain. Now she opened the door and quietly as possible slipped towards her seat. Quigley had his back to her and he scribbled the parts of a fish on a diagram drawn on the board. Each student had an identical diagram on the sheet of paper and was dutifully copying down the parts, anterior, posterior, lateral, ventral, as Quigley wrote them on the board. She glanced down at Tom Charlie's paper and noticed that he had drawn a bra on his fish and had a balloon coming out of his mouth. "When the going gets tough," he had written. "The tough go fishing." Nancy tried to stifle a giggle, but it was too late. She'd been noticed. Quigley whirled around from the board and placed his hand on the back of his chair. He leaned forward, thrusting his big raw face towards her. Even across the room she could see the network of veins in his ruddy cheeks and bushy eyebrows that hung like partially drawn curtains over his tiny, deep-set eyes. He jabbed the chalk at her. "I see that is not enough," he sputtered, "to insult me and the rest of the class by arriving late. But now that you have condescended to attend to insist on disrupting the other students with your inane giggling, sit down, Miss Antone, and I'll see you after school." "Like hell you will," thought Nancy as she slid into her seat and opened her biology book. There was yet another diagram of a fish, all parts colored-coded. "Geez," she thought, "when it comes to things that are really important, like parts of a fish, you can't repeat them too much." The period crawled by with agonizing slowness. Nancy felt her head pitch forward as she dozed off. She caught herself before slamming into the hard Formica desktop, but almost immediately her eyes began to droop again. She tried desperately to find some kind of diversion, but it was impossible to make contact with other students. They either gazed numbly into space or stared with unfocused eyes at their books. She tried to study the mountains through the narrow window slots at each end of the room, but all she could see was the bank of raw dirt outside that one day might be a landscape. "My God," she thought, "it is only 9:15. Nancy practically sprinted up the hall when the period had mercifully dragged to an end. Leaning up against the locker, she squeezed her eyes shut. How much longer could she stand this? She sensed someone standing in front of her and opened her eyes a crack. Even between lashes she recognized the unmistakable bulk and shock of blonde hair. Mark Bateman, basketball star, class valedictorian, and general creep, was trying to hit on her again. "What's the trouble, baby?" Mark said, clenching and unclenching his fist and slowly rotating his massive shoulder as though he was on the dance floor. "Old Quigley gave you a rough time?" "Mark, I don't know who's a bigger geek, you or Quigley." Mark feigned a hurt expression. "Now, is that any way to talk to a guy you're going out with this Saturday?" "Mark, how can I make it clear? I not only don't want to go out with you, it disturbs me that we have to share this same planet. One of the best reasons to leave this town, and there are a lot of good ones, is to avoid your arrogant, bumbling attempts at charm." Nancy turned and started down the hallway. "You just don't know what you're missing," he called after you. "I can hardly stand the suspense," muttered Nancy. She almost fled down the stairs to her home economics class. Thank God for Bernice Wu, Nancy thought, as she walked into the class early. Bernice's class. Bernice insisted everyone call her by her first name. It was like an oasis. Nancy couldn't quite put her finger on why. It wasn't just that she was nice. Most of the teachers were nice outside of class, even though what they taught was useless. Or that she was relaxed, though she certainly was. It was something more. She really cared about the people in her class, not just as students, but as people. She was the only teacher who asked about the students' families, or even seemed to know they had families. Once Nancy's father had gotten drunk and fell down an icy embankment, breaking his leg. Nancy had been called in the middle of the night and walked across the bridge to the hospital. The next day Bernice, gentle concern in her brown eyes, had asked how he was. Then, seeing the fatigue in Nancy's eyes, she put her arm around the girl's shoulders. "Listen, you go and get some sleep," she suggested. "I'll tell the office I sent you home because you were ill." And Bernice was always there, in school or out, to talk. Her classroom and home were always open. But something else made her special, too. Maybe it was the way she worked with students, gliding quietly around the room, helping, waiting patiently, helping again. And she never seemed to need seem to need to be asked for assistance. Somehow she just knew and was there. There didn't seem to be the physical barrier that was with other teachers either. Sometimes it was as simple as brushing shoulders, but occasionally she would, just out of sheer joy and affection, hug someone. It was a little shocking at first, but students realized the genuineness of her gesture. They came to appreciate and love the woman who glowed like a warm ember in the ash of a dead fire. As Nancy put her books on the counter and sat on a stool, she looked up to see Bernice's smiling face. Maybe it was just her smile, thought Nancy. Maybe it was simple as that. It was as warm and genuine as Bernice herself. Today she was especially appreciated. "How's it going?" Bernice asked. Nancy shrugged. "So far I have been threatened by Donut and humiliated by Quigley, and it's just second period." "Say, sounds like just an average day at Craigton Secondary," Bernice grinned. "I'll get the medic. We've been known to give aid and comfort to the enemy in here. And look on the bright side. Graduation is just 3 months away." Other students were beginning to straggle into class. Most were female, but a few males were courageous enough to take a course that taught the most practical skills offered while having to endure the insults and taunts of the Mark Batemans of the school. Jacob Warraby settled in next to her. "I heard the Mad Bull is science